You know what the main problem with choice in video games is? It is typically so black and white. I've played a lot of interactive stories in my time, and it always seems like there's three big problems. 1. Your choices are binary. You do the good thing or the evil thing. You take the renegade option or the paragon. 2. Your choices don't have realistic payoffs. You save a helpless princess from getting killed by a spy, but she still hates you afterwards because you didn't have enough karma points. And number 3, choices are just an illusion. The game ends and ignores your choices, kills off whoever it wants to, and presents the outcome that it already had predetermined. Now, I'm not some pretentious wannabe game designer that's searching for existentialism through a haze of bong smoke or something. No, it's easy to pick apart bad cause and effect and short-sighted game directing, and a purely moronic stringing together of words that many studios consider player choice. No, I'm talking about the lack of consequence. Consequence, not exactly a pervasive element in today's modern gaming cinematic vision. Take for instance Telltale, notorious for providing false choices while bravely touting, "This story adapts to the choices you make as soon as you start." Kind of true, but not really. Telltale often blatantly rips out player choice in favor of just presenting whatever the hell it wants to. Batman, Game of Thrones, even The Walking Dead, they just pretend that what you chose to do had more of an impact than what it did, as they all at some point undo some decision that was made by the player, slicing apart the idea that an actual cause can lead to an effect. Games that do it right allow for the gray area to be explored so that the game doesn't run over the actual player experience. Now, you could argue that the closest anyone has gotten to this point in the games industry would be David Cage, the founder of Quantic Dream. Cage, the decisive figure behind the iconic Heavy Rain, Beyond Two Souls, and most recently, Detroit Become Human, creates movie-like interactive games that are very much player determinant, wherein choices made have a radical impact on how those stories unfold, that characters can die, that a player can fail, that things can happen that can't unhappen and the game keeps going. And the fallout of that choice, while the player is under the duress of a ticking clock, can be emotionally impacting, artistically thought-provoking, and elicit a human response based off of how those choices shape the future of the game. Cage has been notoriously defiant towards traditional game mechanics while crafting these somewhat utopian game concepts, often removing the idea that games should be built as absolute, going so far to remove the classic game over or you win precedents set by virtually every game in existence. He states, "I've always felt that game over is a state of failure more for the game designer than from the player." He goes on, "It's like creating an artificial loop that says, you didn't play the game the way I wanted you to play it, so now I'm going to punish you, and you're going to go back and play it again until you do what I want you to do." Instead, Cage allows an entire game story to play out without recourse and despite any negative outcomes that would arise, both in terms of the scenarios presented to players and the impact they have on the world. Well, as much as a game can possibly do before logically breaking in two. I admit it's a very interesting way to approach design, and though many games have tried their hand at the quote-unquote interactive story, Life is Strange, the Telltale games, hey, even Cage's prior games, they haven't really been able to fully capture that mind-bending dynamic cause and effect nebulae that Cage himself has been working towards. That is until Detroit Become Human in 2018. The concept of expanding choice in games is something I think a lot of people care about, as it creates a gateway into player feedback by hedging on a variety of human emotions, values, ethics, and perhaps most importantly, the idea of morality. When a game enforces a difficult moral choice onto a player, those players really have to think about what they're going to do in that moment, because the outcome of that choice is unknown, leaving the player in a state of dilemma, confusion, perhaps questioning as to how to proceed forward, especially when that choice isn't crystal clear. In a game, those decisions can lead to alternative and often unexpected outcomes, perhaps as well, leaving players sitting in a puddle of their own emotional investments in the cause presented. As they have some personal impact on how it unfolded, they controlled it, and they did it, without the game ever resetting its own current state. We know a game can only stretch 42.84 gigs of data and a $30 million budget so far, so naturally there will be some concessions that need to be made to make this happen. And for Detroit, there's a whole heap that I will eventually talk about, but for now, having a consistent story is out of the question. So if you were hoping for a game to lead up to one all-encompassing finale that brought together every painstaking blood, sweat, and tear detail poured into the game, is something you are never going to find. Yeah, it's true, some outcomes of Detroit seem to have a lot more work put into them than others. Choose-your-own adventure games require resources to be split among all avenues of cause and effect, and if you're going to honor that system, you cannot ignore any of them, regardless of how important you think any one may be over the others. As again, this is a game for players, not developers, because if it wasn't, they would decide the ending, not you. It's like reading Goosebumps or The Cave of Time. You get a hodgepodge of wildly different experiences that force one of many, many different outcomes. What this means to the player is that depending on how you play the game and what choices you make, your final satisfaction mileage will vary quite a bit. If you only played Detroit Become Human once, you'll only get to see one section of the total game content, aka one piece of the bigger pie. Everything else, all those hours of content, you'll never get to see. Again, if you don't replay it, which many people won't. Think about it this way. If you play Uncharted from start to finish, you basically get everything, with a finale that an actual storyteller deemed the best possible fit. In Detroit, you do get an ending that's more tailored to your own self-interests, but does that make it the strongest possible conclusion for the complete storyline? Now that is tough to say, and a big old can of worms. However, the sheer amounts of player-driven content will have something for everyone, and the fact that the story keeps going forward regardless of choices is a very strong feature that puts a lot of agency into the player. This idea that a game can continue to push forward regardless of what the player does is really the best thing about Detroit, specifically when you look at what can happen to the major and minor characters without the story stopping. For example, Kara's storyline, one of the main characters, can end in a shocking amount of ways. You can get killed by Todd during Stormy Night. You can get run over by a car during On the Run. Zlatko can kill you in his creepy haunted house. The cops can shoot you during Battle for Detroit. Or you can get decommissioned and recycled in the finale. There could be a few more, I'm not too sure. Other characters like Connor can be killed and remade multiple times. His partner can be killed, Luther can die, Markus, you name it. Some as soon as their opening chapters. Not every developer has the audacity to create a game where players can miss over 1/3 of the entire storyline, all of which playing out under the direct influence of the player. Detroit Become Human is one of the closest games to enter this moralic feedback loop and come out the other side without the system feeling thin, flawed, shallow, or simply an illusion that means nothing when the credits roll down. After all, we've all been there, playing a game that presents a choice, but really it doesn't mean anything in the end. At times, the writing can't keep pace with it, as there's so many twists and turns that intersect constantly, being very heavy-handed and sudden as well, changing lanes all the time in what seems to be a hurry, especially early on, as with the case of quickly getting rid of Markus and Carl's a really fantastic companion story, so they can usher Markus along to his next story beat, which is a tale of being the RA9 saving grace messiah, or with forceful dialogue choices like, in the same instance, Markus calling Carl dad before he dies, which just seems really out of place, given the current state of the game, pointing at the obvious foreshadowing of moral choice to come. Though for the most part the game does a great job avoiding this kind of stuff, and it's best when it focuses instead on the empowerment of players to shape the story instead. Through this network of choices and consequence that at first boggles the mind, 6 different outcomes for the prologue alone, 50 different endings or so, huge trees of branching paths broken down into the most microscopic decision, chances to kill off important characters, etc. The butterfly effect storyboard of Detroit is really the best part about this game, as it puts so much control into the hands of those who play it. Naturally, there are some instances during the story multiple times where it's clear what decision will lead to XY outcome, but for the most part it's integrated really well, and in my opinion it pushes video game interactive storytelling into a land beyond the expected, though as a video game its extremely outdated mechanical systems do leave a lot to be desired. I don't believe Detroit to be a good video game for the sake of its mechanics. I believe it's a good video game in spite of having poor mechanics. Truthfully, I'd go so far to say that Detroit really isn't much of a video game at all, as there isn't much to the gameplay, beyond holding the direction stick forward and just obeying button prompts. I will give it to the animators though. The fighting choreography is awesome, with the Jason Bourne style quick cuts, Connor pulling out karate moves like he just downloaded the Kung Fu program straight out of the Matrix. It looks fantastic, but most of the gameplay really only serves as those tiny little spectacle treats, as you're not actually controlling it. My main issue with Detroit is that there is nothing holding this game back or this concept back from providing high quality real-time action gameplay to the player. The entire game is about player-driven interactiveness, right? Well, there's nothing less interactive than having to watch a cool fight scene play out, then kick the guy's ass yourself. Wiggling the analog stick in a Hadouken motion while mashing the button that flashes on the screen is not peak interactivity. This is gameplay from 1999's Shenmue. Van Damme would not find this acceptable. Gameplay could have easily been translated into real time with QTEs after the player has played through most of the action, such that the integrity of the choice system could be upheld while still providing more interactivity, which is the point of this game, to the player. This really is among a few other negative elements: decidedly stiff controls, a colossal amount of invisible walls, and one very annoying level in which Markus has to find Jericho, which is nothing more than a game of hide-and-go-seek, is the thing that holds the actual moment-to-moment gameplay of Detroit back from being anything other than just okay or just passable. Take a look at this action scene and pause right here. Doesn't this scream cover-based shooter Uncharted? Damn, I mean, I would have loved to play this out. But no, you just press buttons to play Detroit Become Human. And I think a lot of people would like more to their gameplay interactiveness than being a button-pressing bitch, especially considering Detroit's storytelling interactiveness is exceptionally good. It's not like there isn't flashes of joy in the gameplay departments, because there is. It's just sad that they exist only in one of the 3 playable character stories. Connor, the android hunter I'll soon talk about, has some really cool detective-style gameplay in which you can speed through and rewind time to find clues to solve bits of crimes. It's strangely satisfying stuff, partially because it gels with the nature of being a crime detective, but more so for the fact that it's more interactive than a traditional QTE. Isn't that something? Unfortunately, the other 2 stories, which I'll also cover in depth here in a sec, don't really get this gameplay mechanic, and rely almost exclusively on quick-time events, which does make those stories feel like less of a game and more of an interactive story simulator. Objectively speaking, there's nothing functionally wrong with the QuickTime system in Detroit Become Human. It does its job, it moves things along, and truth be told, it does provide a platform for players to make choices in the moment. Both mechanically, failing XY button prompt kills Y character, aka failing to participate towards XY consequence, which leads to Z outcome. And the timer does create that little bit of needed tension to the decision-making process. Thanks to the fantastic story, delivery, and writing, the interactions do feel compelling to watch play out. But just from a position of pure excitement and again interactive fun, Detroit's QuickTime system is not going to win any awards. In fact, the game itself looks, acts, and feels more like a seasonal TV futuristic police drama, with the game broken down into bite-sized chapters about the same length as a traditional crime show episode. And it's built in the style of that, with a reliance on long, cinematic establishing shots, and an extremely shallow depth of field when moving close. The areas are small, the mechanics are limited, the only gameplay challenge is in reflex-based ergonomics, and the removal of a general failure state ensures that pretty much anyone can win. However, Detroit manages to do the most important thing it sets out to do. It does pull off Cage's Elysian idea that a game doesn't actually need those things, even though some of them could have made the game even better, to accomplish its mission. So the basic premise of Detroit is not unlike a lot of other dystopian or futuristic sci-fi AI books you may have read before. We're introduced to a world where AI robots have superseded human intelligence, go figure, and have already begun to replace humans in the workplace as builders, servants, service personnel, security, prostitutes. Androids represent a new order of subservient, cheap, functional labor without the downsides of human biology. For example, machines don't ask questions, they don't talk back, they never get tired, they execute on their programs in maximum efficiency. Through this development, the valley between the rich and the poor has reached a breaking point, and civilization has reached an obvious standstill in terms of economics. Either way though, the androids live among people, packaged in a photorealistic skin that makes them look like humans. We can only assume the reason for this is to quell the inevitable uneasiness that some humans would have to the idea of machines living in their homes and cities, though this doesn't really seem like it works. Many, like the very quickly introduced raging alcoholic Todd, become hostile towards the androids and beat them to a bloody blue pulp while popping pills and rolling chems. And with the onslaught of protests in the streets and the growing dilemma that machines are going to replace humanity, many of the androids start to feel sadness, pain, empathy, anger, some of the emotional catalysts that set the stage for an android revolution that will shape the future of Detroit. Surrounding this primary cause are supporting elements that are actually quite good. The world is suffering from an irreversible climate turmoil that hints at a looming resource crisis. Conflict between the Eastern and Western civilizations are escalating, potentially towards a war that will utilize androids, and the dreading notion that humans may be becoming over-reliant on technology, which has led to civil unrest as growing resentment towards machines propels onwards. It's captivating stuff. We've certainly seen it before, but just the setting alone, packaged with these material, presents a pretty compelling experience to be had. That's because, eerily, Detroit really does exist not too far outside the realm of our own imagination, that one day we may end up there. Perhaps not androids, but some form of artificial intelligence that is capable of learning to this degree, and humans having to come to terms with it in some way or another. This familiarity is what initially pulled me in, as I could see our own society one day, hundreds of years down the road perhaps, arriving at this exact moment, over-relying on technology, overdosing on feel-good drugs to cloud the misery of our own futility as more efficient life forms begin to replace our own utility. I hated the character Todd in Kara's story, but the more I thought about him, the more I understood how being a washed-up, alcoholic ex-taxi driver that was replaced by a machine could lead him to being the way he is, which is a good representation of some of the events in Detroit Become Human. Events that speak to the idea that it's a little bit easier to care about something, or at least try to understand it, when you can reach out and touch it, per se. When a game doesn't take place in some faraway galaxy or fictional mushroom kingdom, events become more tangible and, in my opinion, more relatable. And for the most part, I think Detroit really understands this. Whether it's a well-acted cutscene, an important yet concise moment in dialogue, or a choice that impacts an important issue, or reading about the troubles of society in a magazine on a kitchen table, Cage really has a knack for consistently drip-feeding world detail and lore that's reachable into the equation to really get players to care about what is happening. And through the absorption of it, both indirectly and directly, players will likely take a side to all of this conflict, human and machine, maybe somewhere in between, making hard choices that have dramatic impacts on you, the friends, the enemies, and how others see you. Decisions that are ultimately pretty unclear, and it's in that obscurity that Detroit really shines as an interactive video game. Of the three characters you get to control, I think Connor seems to be the most intriguing and arguably most central to the story. Operated and controlled by humans, Connor is a smooth, very straight-laced, deviant hunter whose job is to find machines who have gone rogue and hunt them down. No surprise, given his job title. Sort of like a futuristic Blade Runner. He partners with Hank, who's a human detective, and the buddy cop duo becomes enveloped in a series of deviant murders which they must investigate the causes of. Through the scenarios, a looming question continues to arise that ties back to the moral agenda of Detroit. What is the function of a machine, and can they develop free will? Hank, because he innately hates machines, yet continually gets dragged into questioning his own loyalty to his own species, and Connor, who ultimately must confront Detroit's fundamental question. Do I have the right to be free in the first place? Entirely dependent on how the player sees fit, Connor may align with the machines he's sent to destroy. He may liberate them from humanity, or he may side with the humans, or start off anti-machine, and then just go rogue, slowly becoming entranced in the idea that maybe he should side with his own kind. While Kara is consistently presented with emotionally tugging decisions, Connor is presented with a series of scenarios that are always morally ambiguous despite being emotionally testing or not. Some are offered directly, such as Connor choosing to help an android or save his partner on a rooftop instead of completing his mission. Others are more subtle, such as the option to pick up and conceal a gun in the first level, which goes against his innate programming. In fact, the entire story of Connor is about him choosing a side, and this internal rebellion against his programming and Amanda, as the story unfolds, really always kept me interested all the way up to the end. What I really liked about Connor is his relationship with Hank. They have this certain buddy cop thing going on, with Connor being the straight-laced analytic and Hank being the hard-nosed, apathetic cheese grater on a collision course with OD suicide. Along with the just straight oddity of the appearance of the two of them, it's the contrast of their personas that really makes them a good team. This idea that Connor can make Hank feel affection for androids, and Hank can of course make Connor feel affection towards humans, or actually vice versa, depending on what the player does. Thus, despite the initial discrimination and hatred towards machines of Hank can actually end up being fairly relatable despite his prickly personality, because his story can turn into one of actual redemption if the player pursues it. It's a shame one of the playable characters isn't human, even if it was Hank for a little bit, as Connor's story can lead to deviance. It would have made things a little bit more interesting, though 4 characters may have just been a little bit too much to handle. I digress. Let's move on to the next character, Kara, who can develop autonomy while taking care of Alice, a young girl who lives in a broken, destitute home, constantly afraid of being beaten by her asshole, drunken father. She can help Alice escape the home and potentially kill Todd, exo in the process become a mother to a human child on the run and in search of a new home where the two can live in peace. Or, should she choose to remain subservient, again this is up to the player, in this or a variety of other moments in her story, become just another machine that was destroyed by an angry human. Now obviously this maternal-paternal child dynamic has been presented in other media many times. War of the Worlds with Cruz, The Road, The Last of Us among others, wherein someone older guides the youngling to safety, or knowledge, or prosperity, or something like that, typically amidst horrible or violent circumstances such as the world falling apart, or aliens invading the world, or a witch hunt, for example. Kara and Alice find themselves in pretty similar circumstances, and see the most personally twisted and rocky road of all the characters, constantly being screwed over, getting attacked by humans, or having to just manipulate other people just to survive. Thus, Kara can really turn out to be sort of the hero in this capacity, as many of her choices are an effective tool at hugging at her own self-protective nature. I like Kara's story quite a bit, even though it can feel quite distant from the other two storylines. Some say it's a shame that Kara is forever confined to the stereotype of a victimized female character, as she is forever preyed upon by men in this game. It's true, Cage does fall victim to dumping Kara and Alice into the fight or flight trope, but they're hardly put in victimizing situations where they can't overcome their own adversity. Being a victim only works if you can't do anything about it. The truth is, along with other female characters like North, the females in this game have the power to fight back and rise above all their misfortunes. Kara can survive both Todd and Zlatko, the two more male-heavy oppressors in their journey, and she can even kill Todd, don't you forget. In fact, the only way for Kara to succumb to quote-unquote victimization anyway is for the player to actively go out of their way to let it happen. And in Detroit that means failing QTEs on purpose or choosing to pursue things that would dissuade from the path of oppression, which is a player choice, thus creating the falsehood of victimization by themselves. And speaking of North, who is not only an extremely independent and headstrong female character, she can go on to lead the resistance and become the savior of the android army should Markus perish, thus becoming one of the most idolized characters in the game.
We're gonna do this. We're gonna get to that fucking camp and free our people.
Cage definitely is not the most original storyteller, and sure, Detroit has moments where you just want to roll your eyes, such as the segregation of androids on the bus, for instance. But to say that Detroit Become Human is nothing more than a misogynistic, power-tripping male fantasy that victimizes females when they can be so empowered and emboldened throughout the entire game is pretty much horseshit, and just another example of journalists posterizing games unfairly without taking the time to understand them. Finally, there's Markus, who on the surface seems to have the most important role of all the androids, as the leader of the resistance, the messiah, the Jesus Christ-like figure. Oddly enough, I found his story arc actually to be the least exciting. Although he does have some emblematic moments, such as when he and North can fall in love on the rooftop, or his brief relationship with Kara, which is excellent and plays out the game title of Become Human, hinting at the notion of Markus becoming the messiah and freeing his people. I found him to be a little bit flat and predictable. Most players will either see Markus become a peaceful protester or a violent rogue leader, and honestly, I didn't find much gravity in between. Kara does fall into this trap somewhat, as you're essentially playing the Outlaws on the Run card, but she's simply surrounded by far more interesting characters and gameplay scenarios. The initial Todd sequence is great, the chase scene at Zlatko's creepy mansion is eerie, meeting the Jerrys at Pirates Cove, Ruby at the border, or escaping the entrapment, or getting destroyed for that matter, at the recycle camp are all really well done. In fact, if there was ever one scene that stuck with me, it's this one. There's a certain amount of uneasiness watching the reflections of history come to life in another work of fiction, whether it's with war stories, discrimination, or in this case, a sort of genocide concentration camp feel. I find it oddly disturbing watching the androids march to their doom even though they're just pixels on the screen, swallowed up by the big crushing machines like they were cattle going to the slaughterhouse. I think it was because I had just seen Kara and Alice strip off their human skin, which was weird and creepy and cool at the same time. Everything changed except their eyes, staring back at you, the same eyes as you saw them in their own human skin. You could see the humanity in them still there, inside them, still working as intended, still affected by what you've done in the last 15 hours. The fear, the confusion, the despair, everything all embroiled in those beady eyes. Again, it was weird, but it was just something I couldn't pull away from, you know? Unfortunately, I never escaped the camp on my first playthrough. In fact, I never knew I could. That's really the beauty of Detroit for me. There's so many tiny hidden moments, and there's this constant feeling that you've missed something, that you could have done this different or that different, saved someone, found a better outcome. The creeping feeling of regret was my constant sensation playing Detroit. I remember when I played Detroit Become Human a few years ago. I actually played like a total jackass and tried to wipe out humanity and lead a great machine revolution. The fact that I've replayed the game since and have seen entirely new developments to the story by doing things different is really quite cool. And it's cool because those decisions, objectively speaking, can impact the story all the way to the end. And unlike some other games we won't mention, the permanency is actually there. Choices matter. The ending is personal to you and you live with the outcomes you create. The game actually wants you to play from this position of intuition, as it lets you go back and replay chapters if you didn't like what happened. So circling back to the start of this video, I asked the question, have we made an evolution here, at least in terms of evolving choice in video games? I feel like Detroit does make good on its promise to allow players to jump right into that experience and make those choices, for good or bad. It ties them around a really compelling, not too far-fetched setting, with phenomenal voice acting and really eye-popping graphics. Sadly, the gameplay really doesn't do the game any service, and for that reason, I almost feel like Detroit would be better off as a standalone TV show. It's hard to say that, but that's really how I feel about it. But the weird part is that would remove one of the most vital components of this title, which is the ability for players to impact the story, how it plays out, what happens to those in it, how it comes to an end. Quality game mechanics, smooth controls, and the ability for players to control during action would compromise very little of the game's integrity, so long as they left the other systems in place, especially the detective-style gameplay, which in fact is really, really good. I found it oddly satisfying. Again, there's really no gameplay with it, but the concept is solid, makes sense, and it adds this nice flavor to the experience, because that's what a detective would do. In fact, that's really my only qualm with Detroit. It's just more of an experience than a game. Oddly enough, though, it's only possible as a video game. Detroit Become Human set out to tell a story that shined brightest in the moments of our own intuition and feelings. It presents a beautiful canvas for that painting to come to life by the player. If the individual characters were the colors, then a few of them would definitely stand out. A couple of them would be predictable as well. Just one of them would make for a great picture, though. If you combined all of them, though, into a single composition, they do make for a game that's beautiful, memorable, and definitely worth playing. Not to mention the game has the best main menu screen of any game. You just have to experience it for yourself. It might not be for everyone, but the fact is that Cage's Detroit does transcend a lot of the challenges in modern game storytelling. But there's a lot to improve on in the gameplay department, the invisible walls, some of the janky animations, and some of the strange writing decisions just that seem to be forced for the sake of moving the story forward. But when I look back on it, a few years later, I can accept it for what it is. Not the pinnacle of game storytelling by any means, but a game that tries to push the idea of interaction and consequence forward in some pretty meaningful ways. And for that, I just can't wait to see what's next. Detroit's a good game that empowers that rare sense of player agency by presenting touching moments that come to life beautifully on the screen. To be honest, I'm pretty torn in two with Detroit. On one hand, it has a great story, and the choice element consistently provides room for players to explore lots of options, and that very rare gray area that I alluded to at the beginning of this video. In fact, I think it's one of the best interactive simulations you can find outside of Alpha Protocol, which I'd also recommend for the narrative interactiveness that game has as well. But in the gameplay departments, it really doesn't do anything for me that Shenmue or Grim Fandango or Life is Strange doesn't already provide. So there's room, I think, in Cage's next game to take this evolutionary interactiveness that I want to stress is very strong, but then add some cool modern gameplay on top of it. Truth be told, I'm a fan of linear games, and I always find games with a single ending a lot more satisfying than those with a handful or 100. I feel like I'm getting the peak experience because everything leads up to that one moment, and everyone who was working on that game poured everything in the detail, the gameplay, the story, and it's all waiting for me in the finale. It's nice to have some say in a game, don't get me wrong, but how many of those games really do anything with it? Only a few. Detroit is one of those games, so I can objectively recommend it based off of what it provides. But there are certainly downsides to all games that branch off in a million different directions, as really some things aren't going to get the attention they need to. Detroit falls victim to this, as all games do without a central story, so it's not the fault of the game, it's more the fault of the concept. If you're looking for a game you can play once, I don't recommend Detroit. It deserves multiple playthroughs because the amount of content that can be ingested in a single playthrough is inconsistent, both in terms of quality and quantity. But if you play it a few times, man, is it a pretty compelling experience, all things considered.